It's forever changed. Carmen, I can't hug her anymore.
I don't like to restrict anybody's Second Amendment rights.
State leaders have a new round of bills about firearms in their sights.
We have more guns than people in our country right now.
But some gun rights advocates say banning magazines with more than 10 rounds and other restrictions are way off target.
We need to start looking at the criminal.
But in a short session in Olympia, which proposals will prevail?
It's a matter of life and death.
We hear from both sides.
How are they going to pay for that?
A loaded discussion about gun rights. Next on City Inside Out. Welcome to this edition of City Inside Out. I'm your host, Brian Callanan. State lawmakers have been working on more than a dozen bills about firearms this year, from restrictions on large capacity magazines to a new statewide system of background checks. Gun control advocates say Washington needs to continue its strong response to what they call an epidemic of shooting deaths across our state and our country. But gun rights supporters say their proposed bills would create unfair restrictions on law-abiding gun owners. The last few years in our state have been marked with major changes to our gun laws. But the question now, will that continue into the new decade, with a short session in Olympia set to end in a matter of weeks? April Schentrup sent her two daughters to school in Parkland, Florida on February 14th, 2018, a date she will never forget.
Only one of them came home safe that night.
Carmen Schentrup, a week shy of her 17th birthday, was one of the 17 victims at Marjorie Stoneman Douglas High in what is infamously the deadliest school shooting in U.S. history.
After Carmen's death, it was hard to, just get through the day.
Frustrated with what she saw as a lax approach to school safety following the shooting, April moved her family to the Puget Sound region that fall. She wants lawmakers to know it's time for some new answers to the problem of gun violence.
And that's all I would like to ask for them, is to really look at things and come up with a solution for keeping their community safe.
I think this bill is going to save lives.
State Senator Patty Kuderer is sponsoring 4 out of more than a dozen bills about guns proposed this session in Olympia.
I think that we can put reasonable restrictions on gun ownership.
Recent history may be on her side. Voter-approved I-1639 went into effect last year, raising the purchase age for semi-automatic rifles to 21, enhancing background checks for those firearms, and instituting a safe gun storage provision.
Senator Kuderer, did you want to speak to the amendment?
In 2020, the most hotly contested bills include a call for a new state office of firearm violence prevention, a plan to require additional training for people with concealed pistol licenses, and a ban on magazines that hold more than 10 rounds of ammunition, what Kuderer sees as a way to limit casualties in a mass shooting situation.
That seems to me to be a reasonable balance that you strike between your desire to defend yourself in your home and also protecting the rest of us from someone who's got evil intent.
It is not up to us to tell a gun owner how many bullets it could take to stop a threat.
Senator Lynda Wilson says the ban on high-capacity magazines, a law in 9 states and the District of Columbia, violates the Second Amendment.
We are all entitled to a self-defense, and in fact, it's an inalienable right.
Wilson does support legislation for a centralized background check as a way to streamline our state's current patchwork system for gun purchases and exchanges. But beyond that, she's pushing for tougher penalties involving stolen guns, like the ones she believes were used by the suspects in the recent downtown Seattle shootings.
It was crazy that these people were still on the street. I think that's the direction we have to start going. We can't keep going toward the law-abiding citizen.
I don't like to restrict anybody's Second Amendment rights.
Jane Milhans, a firearms safety instructor in Tacoma, who says she was inspired to do this work after 2 men broke into her home more than a decade ago, is especially focused on women and guns.
for women, it's an equalizer. It levels the threat between us and an attacker.
She says a ban on high-capacity magazines would force women to use smaller, sometimes more difficult-to-handle handguns.
I cannot pull this thing back with two hands.
She's also concerned about requiring safety classes for people who want concealed pistol licenses, which is the law in more than half the states in the U.S. and the District of Columbia. Milhans says women sometimes need that permit quickly, when facing domestic disputes, for example, and wouldn't have the time for potentially weeks of training.
The wait times take away the right of a citizen to protect himself. We're not the ones committing the crimes, but we are the ones who are consistently have been punished for the last few years.
Is it punishment or the proper approach to gun rights? At the dawn of a new decade in our state, the debate continues.
I have to kind of beg for my right to protect myself, and I shouldn't have to do that as a citizen of Washington State.
I have 2 other children that I need to fight for, so that's what keeps me going.
And joining us to discuss this topic further, we have with us Emily Cantrell. She is a board member of the Alliance for Gun Responsibility and a survivor of the 2017 Las Vegas shootings. Emily, good to have you with us.
Thank you for having me.
We also have with us Dave Workman. He is editor-in-chief of thegunmag.com, published by the Second Amendment Foundation. Dave, good to see you again.
Thank you.
And let me break this down with you both, but before we really get into the actual bills themselves, I want to talk about generally what you're expecting to see out of Olympia this year. This is a short session. It's supposed to wrap up on March 12th. We have a lot of gun bills on the table. Is the political will in place for 2020 to enact some tougher gun laws within this short time frame? Emily, what do you think? What do you expect?
I believe so. I mean, each year we're hearing more and more bills in our state capitol, and I think our voices are finally being heard.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you for that. Dave, I'll go to you. Just some brief ideas here. Your expectations for this session.
Well, I expect some legislation to pass. I'm not sure which it's going to be yet because we still have a few weeks to go. But from the firearms owners that I've been talking to, all of these represent, except in a few cases, just further erosion of their rights under the state and federal constitutions. Yeah. So I think the legislature is going to have to balance that a little bit, and before they take action.
Okay, well, let's try to balance out some of the different pieces in play here. Dave, I'll start with you here, and I'll focus on the high-capacity magazine legislation, Senate Bill 6077. This would ban magazines with more than 10 rounds of ammunition. There's a House version of the bill that has a limit of 15. So the idea is to at least force a pause in mass shooting situations where higher-capacity magazines are so often used, as in Mukilteo here in our state in 2016. Force that pause so people can escape, law enforcement can act. What are your concerns with this concept?
Well, I think that this is it gives people a false sense of security. A retired sheriff friend of mine who's now the chief operating officer down at a place called Gun Sight in Arizona did a video a few years ago when he was a sheriff over in Indiana, and they compared rates of fire and the speed with which you could swap out a magazine with an AR-15, and there's virtually no difference. Somebody who is skilled at doing that can maintain fire, and I think that trying to limit magazine capacity for people who own these things, and there's millions of them out there, I'm not sure how you could really ban them. It may sound good, but I'm not sure that it's really going to be feasible or even prevent any kind of a crime.
Okay. Emily, your thoughts on this? This is something you've experienced firsthand, I know, in Las Vegas, the deadliest mass shooting in modern history here in the U.S. The shooter fired more than 1,000 rounds in about 10, 15 minutes. You've heard some of Dave's critiques of this bill. How do you respond to that?
Well, I would disagree. I mean, the reason I'm able to sit here today, one of the reasons is because the shooter had to stop and reload. And limiting high-capacity magazines, the number of bullets that a shooter can fire, I mean, it's a matter of life and death. And take the shooting that happened in Seattle just last month. Sure. One of the suspects, he was prohibited from owning a firearm, but he was able to go out and buy a high-capacity magazine just hours before the shooting. Fortunately, that one, it didn't have as high a capacity as some of the others, but these should not be on our streets.
Yeah. Dave, any thoughts about this, just some of the back and forth? I've heard some lawmakers argue about this. They're saying maybe this strikes a bit of a balance between allowing people in their homes who want to defend themselves, that ability, but still trying to limit the people who might have bad intent. Your thoughts?
Well, you're not going to be able to stop a person who's determined to commit a horrible crime. I think our crime stats show that.
But maybe you could lessen the impact, I guess.
Well, I don't know if you can lessen the impact or not. It depends on when and where these things happen. You know, you brought up Third and Pine.
Yeah.
All three of those guys are prohibited from having firearms.
Right.
They're all convicted felons.
Yep.
They've got rap sheets that are way long.
Yeah.
I would very much like to see more focus on certainty of punishment for these guys. Remember, 20-some years ago, we passed 3 strikes and you're out in hard time for armed crime. Those guys with their backgrounds, they should have been behind bars.
Okay.
And here they are.
Well, and we're going to dive into that issue in just a little bit, but thank you for opening the door on that. Emily, I want to move on to concealed pistol licenses and some of the issues surrounding these. Senate Bill 6294 would require additional training for such a license, including live fire training, learning about suicide prevention, and more. The pushback I'm hearing here from some gun rights advocates is this. Some people need these permits more quickly. Let's say they're in a domestic dispute. They don't have time for what could be a long training process. How do you respond to that piece of it?
I think training is absolutely necessary. I mean, we can't have our cars on the roads without going through driver's ed and taking an exam. You can't go paintballing without having a 30-minute course right before. You can't go skydiving without going through some sort of lesson. So why is it that someone can go get a gun and begin firing immediately? It just doesn't make any sense to me.
Okay. Dave, I'll throw this your way. What's wrong with asking for more training? There are dozens of states that require something like this for a concealed pistol license. Florida, West Virginia among them. Not necessarily places you'd consider all that radical or progressive. Your thoughts?
Well, I'm a certified firearms instructor. And I've been teaching firearms safety for many years, more than 3 decades off and on. And frankly, there's a distinction between having a firearm in this state and going out on a drive or jumping out of an airplane to skydive. We're talking about a constitutionally delineated fundamental right, as opposed to something that's a privilege. And we've had a concealed carry law in this state for about since 1935. So far, as I can tell, we have had a very, very low incident rate of somebody with a concealed pistol license committing a crime, whereas the criminals are actually doing this stuff. Now, I'm all for voluntary firearms training. I think that's great. People should always seek competent instruction before they start carrying a firearm. But once you get the state involved and you start mandating something, there's a likelihood that it's going to get a little crazy, because a lot of these programs are set up by people who don't know anything about firearms.
Okay, and I know that the state's been talking a lot about that in Olympia right now. Senator Fortunato certainly introduced a bill talking about that in particular. Let me throw this to Emily on this one, though. This whole idea that people who carry concealed pistol licenses, they're not the ones causing the problem. Why give them more training or require more training for them?
I just think can't make exceptions. I think everyone should be treated the same. All the gun owners should have to go through the same training.
Okay. Dave, thoughts about that? I mean,
Well, there are various classes around and courses of instruction, and maybe they're not all the same, but they're all good training courses. Again, mandating something when it affects the exercise of a protected right, you got to be real careful with that.
Okay. Dave, I want to stick with you and talk a little bit more about this idea of trying to look at criminals in this situation rather than law-abiding gun owners there. 6402, 6406, the 2 Senate bills I'm interested in, they enhance the penalty for stealing a firearm and also the punishment for using a stolen gun. Senator Lynda Wilson talked to me about this. She really thinks the focus should be on criminals when it comes to our gun laws. What's she getting at, and how would bills like this help in a situation?
Well, I think that you've got to be able to have certainty of punishment. If these people are stealing firearms, if they're using firearms illegally, you're not going to find a gun owner anywhere in the landscape that is going to oppose locking those people up, because all they do is give us a bad name. See? So, and I think Lynda's on the right track.
Emily, your thoughts here? Do you support bills like these, for one? And maybe if we could talk about this concept of trying to focus on criminals using guns, not law-abiding citizens. When you hear that, what goes through your mind?
All I know is our focus at the Alliance is just trying to prevent gun violence before it actually happens, and making sure that we keep these weapons out of the hands of people who should not own them in the first place.
Yeah, I think it's that general argument, though, of trying to focus on criminals using guns rather than people who have gotten these guns in a legal way or whatever else. I think you can understand. I know you've talked to some different people about this. People who have guns feel like they're being targeted here unfairly, and I think that's what I'm getting at here. Do you hear those concerns, I guess, from Dave and other people that are concerned about their gun rights and losing them?
I do, and I think we all have right to the Second Amendment. We all have the right to own a gun. We don't have all the rights to all the ammunition in the world, and you know, it's. I think there's a. Well, unfortunately, it's not such a fine line, but just because we have the right to the Second Amendment doesn't mean that we have a right to all of these bullets and the right to, you know, to forego training and background checks.
Okay. Thank you for breaking that down. And let's talk about the background check piece. And Dave, I'll bring you in here. I think this is one issue that maybe both sides agree on here. Having a centralized statewide background check, it's covered in House Bill 2467. Could you explain to our viewers this patchwork system that's in place right now, some of the challenges involved with that, and maybe how a bill like this might help in that situation?
Well, what I'm hearing from the firearms community, and they do these weekly bulletins, I think most of the firearms activists out there want a centralized background check in this state. And we had NICS for 20-some years.
The FBI's program.
The FBI's program, which is the National Instant Check Background.
Right.
And back when that happened, I think the big sales point on that was it's going to be instant. You take a few minutes to do a background check. If you can background check somebody on his credit card, for example, you ought to be able to do a background check to find out whether he's a criminal.
You would think, yeah.
And so what we have here is a situation where NICS no longer is available.
Right.
And
it was going through a lot of problems in terms of missing some people. Yeah.
Now we've got we're trying to bring in a one-stop shopping, I guess, is about the best way to explain it in layman's terms. We have to have a centralized database to check with. Right now, we've got background checks being done in all 39 counties by sheriff's departments. You've got them being done by city police departments. I've talked to people and traded some email with people who have been waiting for 2 to 3, maybe even 4 weeks to take delivery of a firearm. They should have had on the same day delivery, and they've got CPLs.
It's basically a situation where a gun seller is calling up the different law enforcement agencies. That's what I understand is going on a lot of times.
And also you've got to submit this in writing, and that takes time too. So what began as a 7-day wait for somebody without a concealed pistol license turns into 10 days automatically because you've got the weekend in the middle of that. But now it's going to 2, 3, 4 weeks, and you know, I think part of the reason for that is funding. The sheriff's departments don't have the personnel to just sit down at a desk and do these things all day long. You know, if we're going to do this, we need to do it right.
Emily, your thoughts about this? Any caveats to consider in creating a statewide background check system? Thoughts on this?
Dave is exactly right. I think a lot of it has to do with funding, but we have hundreds of law enforcement agencies here in the state. You know, a lot of them are using these different systems. But this is a common sense bill that does have bipartisan support, and this is a bill that can keep weapons out of the hands of people, like I said before, should not have them.
Washington State Patrol, what are they going to, this is a lot to take on. I know you had mentioned to me earlier concerns about the funding for it, et cetera, how it's going to work.
I think that, you know, the State Patrol, their job is to go out and catch speeders primarily and investigate accidents. And I know
I'm sure they tell you it's a lot more than that, but go ahead.
I used to shoot fatal accident photos for the State Patrol early in my career. So I know what they do. But I think we have reached a point now where the technology certainly is supposed to be there. And if we could fund a position or 2 positions or how many positions it takes, we can restore that so that the law-abiding gun owner, especially somebody with a concealed pistol license, can go in, take same-day delivery of a handgun. And right now, you still get your background checks for long guns through
Yeah.
the NICS system.
Right.
So you can go ahead and buy a shotgun and take it
Yeah.
home on the same day
Yeah.
as soon as you clear. But it's the handguns and these semi-automatic firearms that they call assault weapons. That's the hang-up right now.
Right, and I didn't dive into that issue because it doesn't look like that assault weapon per se. That description is getting out of committee in Olympia right now. But let me stick on this background check. One last piece with you, Emily, on this. Does this idea that Dave's talking about getting a gun immediately same day, does that make sense with you? I know there's a lot of concern over waiting periods or whatever else. Is that something you'd want to institute in a system like this, or any thoughts on that?
Me personally, that makes me terrified. It doesn't seem like a very good idea. If someone is wanting a gun that same day,
But if they've passed certain background checks, I think is the
it still
point.
makes me a little nervous.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. Thank you for that. Yeah.
But understand
That's me personally.
Yeah.
Personally, for me, part of my livelihood, I do firearms reviews and tests. I shouldn't have to be sitting around waiting for a month for somebody to clear a firearm acquisition for me. I'm going to test the gun. I'm going to send it back to the manufacturer.
I see.
I'm a law-abiding citizen. I've got a concealed pistol license. I'm a firearms instructor. So, that's it seems kind of silly to me to maybe compare me to a criminal.
Okay. All right. I know we have a lot more to discuss on that one in Olympia, but I want to move on and talk about the Office of Firearms Violence Prevention. This is Senate Bill 6288, sponsored by Manka Dhingra, the senator out of Redmond. Why is an office like this needed? I know a lot of critics would call it another level of bureaucracy, Emily, but your thoughts on this?
I think this type of office is needed. 3 different areas that it covers, from data, victim support, and a grant program. But we lack a lot of data on gun violence in our own communities, and you can't argue with data, so this office would help fill that gap, and that data is crucial, and finding evidence-based solutions to help gun violence in our community. And then with victim support, I can speak as a survivor of the Las Vegas shooting, and actually just helped introduce a bill with Senator Frocht on victim support or lack thereof. And gun violence, it's something that's so common nowadays, but when a victim goes to find mental health treatment, it's extremely difficult. And I was really glad that I wasn't suicidal after that, because it took a solid month of phone calls and hearing, we can't bill to that code, or not accepting new clients. So I think the office would really help with that. And then the grant program, research being used from other cities like New York and Oakland that do have them. But the office would really provide some funding for these programs.
And I wanted to talk about that data piece. It's just that there are a bunch of disparate programs that need to be brought together. Is that the general thought here with this?
I don't think we have any federal research into gun violence, and I might be wrong.
There's some back and forth
but we
on
don't
that for
have,
sure.
The comprehensive data that would be really helpful to see what gun violence looks like in our community. That's what we're lacking right now.
Okay, got it. Dave, your thoughts about this? I think the idea is to bring together some of these separate data sources to figure out what different communities in our state are going through when it comes to gun violence. What are your concerns with 6288?
Well, first, I'm not sure what you mean by gun violence. Frankly, if you get stabbed to death, what do you call that? Knife violence? I've never heard anybody refer to that. You're demonizing the firearm instead of going after the guy that pulls the trigger. There is just violent crime out there. As far as this office is concerned, I know from talking to my readers, their concern is that you're setting up a bureaucracy whose focus is going to be simply to support more gun control at Washington State in the legislature. If you read the legislation, and I have a couple of times, I can't find any funding mechanism in there. How are they going to pay for that? That's going to cost a lot of money, and it's going to come out of somebody's pocket. And it shouldn't be the firearms owners who wind up paying for that. Because they're not the problem. The law-abiding citizen tries real hard to obey the law. So creating another bureaucracy where it may or may not be necessary is a big concern to these people, because whatever else a gun owner is, he's a taxpayer.
Emily, maybe a thought about that this office is basically just a path to enact more stricter gun control type of laws. I know I've heard that from a number of different critics who are concerned about their gun rights. Any thoughts about that?
I don't agree with that. I think this office would help identify the gaps and really look into the research that's missing. Gun violence does not discriminate, but it does. It's just proportionate in our communities. Black and brown communities are affected by gun violence more, and
Yeah.
there's a lot of focus on mass shootings, but we're not talking just mass shootings. I mean, suicides, domestic violence. There are so many shootings that we don't even hear about each day. I mean, you have to scroll down on websites to find them, or they're buried in Twitter feed. It's just sad how much, I will say the word gun violence we're seeing, but I think this office could help with that.
And I know, just your personal story, if you wouldn't mind sharing some of it. This was, I know, and still is a difficult process for you years later after this. An office like this would have helped you. Do you see it that way, or how do you look at that?
As far as the victim support part, I think it would have,
Okay.
yes.
How so? Just access to the counseling, it sounds like?
Exactly.
Okay.
And what I've come to learn in working with Senator Frocht and his team is that there are resources out there, but they're not widely known. So making sure that those resources are available online, posted for the public to see, would have been really helpful.
Okay, thank you very much for this. I know we've raced through a lot of different legislation here, and I appreciate the back and forth on this. It is time to start wrapping up here. Emily, if you wouldn't mind starting here, if there's some other pieces of gun legislation you'd like to talk about, or any final thoughts or advice for lawmakers as they really start the real work in the next few weeks ahead at our Capitol.
I just want lawmakers to keep on listening, read your emails, answer the phones, and listen to people's stories. Now is the time to really take action and make sure that more people don't have their own stories to tell when it comes to gun violence. And lives are in their hands, and they really can make a difference.
Okay, thank you very much. Dave, some final thoughts for our state lawmakers about these issues?
I think the state lawmakers, the legislature, should also keep in mind that there are a lot of people in this state and across the country who use firearms lawfully to defend themselves and their families every day. Jane Milhans, who you had on here earlier, I know her, and she's a survivor of a pretty nasty situation, which is why she became a firearms instructor.
Right.
Most of the people that I have dealt with over the years have been females. They've been, single moms or women living alone. They come to people like me. They go to the Firearms Academy in Seattle, places like that, to learn to defend themselves, because this is going to sound corny, but it's true. When seconds count, police are minutes away. And the gun owner, typically in a situation like that, becomes his own first responder. And we've got to be very careful about adopting any statutes that might impair their right to self-defense, because the oldest human right there is self-preservation.
Okay, thank you both very much for your input here, and we will be right back.
What's happening in Seattle? Stronger gun laws, I'm all for it.
Why punish legal, law-abiding, trained citizens who have a constitutional right?
We need stronger background checks.
I don't think you need high-capacity magazines to hunt or protect your family, but I believe that we should have the right to bear arms.
We'd like to know what you think. Send us an email at contact@seattlechannel.org, or find us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. Before we close today, it's time for our weekly CIO poll. Do you support more gun control bills in Washington State? Yes, no, or are you undecided? We want to know what you think. Cast your vote and weigh in with your comments at our website, seattlechannel.org/cityinsideout. While you're there, you can watch our programs online anytime. Coming up next time, a controversial proposal to tackle homelessness by allowing King County to tax its biggest businesses. Some major companies are saying yes, but with a major caveat. We'll bring you the latest next time on City Inside Out. I hope you join us.